So what do you do? He asked. I told him, I host this podcast. It's called the Touch MBA podcast. He shifted in his seat, looking surprised. Wait, you're the host? You're Darren? You're the host of the Touch MBA podcast? You're like super popular. I've listened to nearly all of your episodes. I couldn't believe it. This was in July 2016. I was in Shanghai, China at the SEABS boot camp, which is a 1-week event that they offer to applicants to experience what the SEABS MBA experience is like. SEABS is the top ranked program in China. And I was there in mid-2016 covering the program, trying to learn more about the program. And this was a German diplomat named Matthias who was so surprised that he had met the host of the show. Because honestly, I wasn't sure if I should continue. I had started the show in late 2012. I had recorded over 80 episodes. I'd spent probably about 8 to 10 hours per episode to prepare them, to arrange the guests, to record them, to painstakingly edit them. Yes, I do edit the podcasts, so I sound more articulate. And so my guests sound more articulate. There were literally hundreds of hours poured into the show. And many times during those 3 years, I wondered if I should even stick with, recording more episodes. I'd gotten maybe a handful of reviews on Apple Podcasts, but otherwise it was crickets. Those of you who record podcasts know that you're often just talking to your wall in your apartment. You have the best of intentions and you try to be as helpful as you can. And I would imagine an applicant sitting across the table from me, but really what I'm staring at is a wall. And this was for 3 years, and I was putting out an episode every week or two. So this was a real shift for me, meeting Matthias, a diplomat from Germany in Shanghai, and having him tell me that he was a real fan of the show and that it had really helped him. He was almost like a little starstruck, which is just absolutely crazy because at the time I wasn't even sure who was listening. I'm glad I continued, and what I learned from that is I need to get more feedback from my listeners. So every summer I would send out an email asking people on the Touch MBA mailing list, what schools, which MBA programs are you attending? And then I would start to hear, a lot of positive feedback. Of course, it was a self-selecting crowd, but it still feels great to hear something like, I've been listening to your podcast for 3 years and just last week was accepted to HBS. Or someone wrote back and said they were attending Darden and then wrote, and they weren't even on my radar until you recommended them to me. Or someone wrote, I travel often for my job and Darren's voice has welcomed me on my way to and from work for the last 6 weeks. I've listened to 31 of the Touch MBA podcasts. I've been listening to the Touch MBA on Spotify for the past 2 years and used all the advice and knowledge shared during my MBA application journey this year. As the first person in my immediate and extended family to pursue my MBA, your podcast was my go-to resource for me to learn more about schools and the application process. I was humbled to receive an acceptance to Oxford to pursue my MBA. And I want to thank you for all the effort you put into your podcast. Crazy to read things like this, that you might be in someone's ear for 31 episodes, or they might be listening to the show for years. Super humbling and made me want to continue because I knew the show was at least making an impact on, a few dozen people. I mean, I can see the stats, right? I know that the podcast has been downloaded over 1 million times, that it's been listened to for, over 61,000 hours on YouTube, stuff like this. But you just don't know as a podcaster, like who's listening and if it's really helping. And sometimes it's hard when you're staring at the wall of your apartment. I wanted to start this episode with a personal story because it is the 200th episode of the Touch MBA podcast, but also because I want to cover the 3S's of scintillating stories. This episode is inspired by a book I read a few months ago by the Moth. Some of you may have heard of the Moth. It's a really popular podcast where people share stories. It's actually an event, but they record them and then they publish them as a podcast. So what is the Moth? The Moth is a nonprofit organization that celebrates the commonality and diversity of human experience through the art and craft of true personal storytelling. This book is called How to Tell a Story by the Moth, and there's 4 authors: Meg Bowles, Catherine Burns, Jennifer Hickson, Sarah Austin Jennis, and Kate Tellers. I want to share the quote that I will include in our write-up. A well-crafted story helps you create a magical sort of clarity. It can illuminate an experience your audience could not have fathomed a few minutes before, or draw them so close that they imagine they can feel your heart beating. And so this book is really a goldmine of storytelling tips, particularly how to tell a story verbally. The structure of the book, there's 4 main sections. Everyone has a story. Section 1, Section 2, developing your story. Section 3, telling your story. And Section 4, the power of story. I think the second section, developing your story, has a lot of chapters where you as MBA applicants can get a ton of value. For example, some of the chapter titles are Mining for Memories and Beginnings and Endings. But to kind of keep this episode a little shorter, I just want to highlight these 3 S's, 3 tools you can use immediately to improve your stories so you can show adcoms who you really are, because that's what they ask, right? They always ask you, we want to really know the applicants. And stories are often the best way to draw people closer to you. So these 3 S's, these 3 tools are all interrelated. Let's start with the first one. The first S is shift. All stories involve some shift in the storyteller's perspective as a result of something that happened. So when you're mining for stories, consider moments of change in your own life. Okay, so I'm going to list some of the questions they have in this book because I think they're great. So when you're thinking of stories while you're preparing for your MBA interviews, or you're trying to brainstorm your best stories for your essays, here are some questions that can help you. Was there a time that you ... changed a belief you held, had a moment when everything came into focus, discovered you were stronger than you thought, or realized you were just plain wrong? So I think those are great questions. Another way to find great stories where you had a shift in perspective or big change is looking at your toughest decisions and looking at your turning points. So turning points could be, moments that altered your life's course or led you to discover something new. Turning points could be big obstacles or seemingly mundane choices, but that these turning points, affected and ultimately changed you. Again, the first S is shift. So one way to find your best stories is to think about, how would you describe yourself at the beginning of the story and who had you become by the end, right? So if who you are at the beginning of the story is very close or the same as who you are at the end of the story, it's probably not a good story. So to take my podcast example, I think the theme of this story for me is, one is that podcasters and creators in general very rarely know their audience and very rarely know the impact they have on their listeners. But really, the change for me was someone who wasn't sure if he should keep recording the podcast versus someone who was affirmed, who realized that the podcast was actually affecting applicants or affecting his audience. I think that's the change. But really, this story is about persistence, right? It's about sticking with it. That's ultimately what I think the message that's being conveyed. So let's move to the second S. The second S is scenes. They have a really good breakdown in the book where they basically say when you're storytelling, there's basically 3 parts or 3 categories when you're storytelling. One is scenes, the second is summaries, and the third is realizations. The scene in my example is, meeting this German MBA applicant in Shanghai and him being like, oh my gosh, you're the host of the Touch MBA podcast, right? That's a scene that has really stuck out to me because until that time, I'd never met a listener, right? And then I go on and kind of summarize the situation where I, had been recording the podcast for 3 years, oftentimes to my wall in my apartment, not really knowing if it was having an effect on my audience, right? That would be a summary. I kind of sum that up pretty quickly. And then I talk about my realization. My realization is I should keep going and I should try to get more feedback from my audience because that is motivating. And I realize that I'm making an impact, right? So you could kind of break down your stories into scenes, summaries, and realizations. So how can you find the best scenes? Here's some questions to help you do this. If this were a movie, what scenes would keep us glued to our seats? And one way to find the scene is to really focus on a time frame, right? In the movie of your life, what's one scene you'll never forget? Or, for example, in the story of the Touch MBA podcast, for me, what's one scene I'll never forget? And that's the scene with Matthias in Shanghai. And I have others, but I felt like that was, the one I remembered the most clearly, right? So find the scenes. I think in general, MBA applicants tend to spend a lot of their airtime or a lot of their page space on realizations or lecturing. But really what's going to draw you closer to whoever's reading your essays or listening to you as you answer the interview question are these really personal stories that give the interviewer or the reader a better sense of who you are. I could have just said, for example, if someone asked me, Darren, tell me, what are you most proud of with Touch MBA, right? Maybe that's an interview question. And I could just answer, well, I'm most proud of the podcast. I've been doing it 10 years. We're top ranked on Google and Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We've been downloaded over 1 million times, and I'm really proud of the show, right? I could have answered that way, but yeah, I'm blurting out all these numbers and great, you rank higher than Google, but so what? That doesn't say anything about me, right? That doesn't say anything about my journey. It doesn't give them a clue of what I've done or why that's meaningful to me, any of those stats. So try to find the scene, to find the stories, find those turning points, and then really bring them to life, bring them into color, make it like a movie scene. I'm actually embarrassed to tell you guys that, just coming up with that little story at the beginning of the show, that took me a few hours and over a few days to kind of hash that out. It takes work, man, to remember what were the scenes. But anyways, try to find those scenes and spend less time on lecturing or your realizations. I think it's important to still say what you realize, but in general, keep them short. And even as they advise in the book, you don't even have to say, I realized ... Just come to your conclusion. Don't say, I realized I should keep recording the Touch MBA podcast. Instead say, after I met Matthias, I was motivated to record the next 100 episodes or something like that. You don't need to say, I realized, right? And let's get to the final S, which is stakes. Your stories must have stakes. Your actions must have consequences. In my case, the stakes were, should I continue doing this labor of love, that I've been doing for 3+ years? I'm not knowing whether it's really resonating with my audience, right? That's a stake. The stake is a huge investment of time and effort and whether I should continue doing that. And I think that's a really relatable stake, not just to entrepreneurs, but to anyone, right? I think it's tough to know when we should continue with things and when we should pivot or end things. So that's kind of the high stakes of the story. And let me share some of the questions that are in the book that will help you find stories with stakes. You could look for a place, an object, or a friendship that meant a lot to you, or the opposite, a place, an object, or a friendship that almost destroyed you. Try to focus on one moment. Think about a time when you felt an emotion. You doubled over with laughter, you burst into tears, or you lost your cool. Think about a time when you did something you never thought you'd do, or try to be something or someone you aren't. Think about a time when you discovered something about yourself, your environment, your family, or the world. Think about a time when you changed your relationship with someone for better or worse, a little or a lot, or had a secret revealed by you or someone else. Think about a time when you stood to gain or lose something that mattered to you. Or think about a time when you made a tough choice for the right or wrong reason. Finally, my favorite one, think about a time when you found yourself saying, I do, or I won't, or hell no, or I dare you, or you couldn't pay me to, or it would be my greatest honor. So I love these questions, and what they're all really trying to get at are emotional events in your life or emotional stories, right? Because that's really what's going to touch your reader or your listener. And so I think these are great questions to help you find stories with stakes or consequences. And one really cool acronym that I love from the book, and I'm going to curse here, so if you have a child or a young person, please tell them to cover their ears. But the acronym is SNAFU, SNAFU, and this means situation normal fucked up, which I absolutely love. And I think you could use SNAFU to find stories, but it's often a great rubric to start your story, right? Because if you think about the best stories of your life, or at least in my life, it's usually like a normal situation, and then something is just wrong, or something is out of place, or something is different than normal. Okay, let's talk about how these 3S's can be used in your MBA application. All right, so I'm going to go through 4 parts of your MBA application. The first is your interview. I think this book is best suited to help you there, to prepare your stories. Again, just find the scene, find the stakes, and find the shift in perspective, right? I know many of you have probably heard storytelling models like SAR, situation, action, and result, to kind of talk about your work accomplishments. And really, if you think about that, the situation is your chance to paint the scene. And when you're painting that scene, you want to show the stakes in that situation, that this is a really meaningful project or a meaningful decision or a meaningful this or that. Of course, you could talk about the action, what you did. That's usually like a summary, perhaps, or maybe your scene illustrates your action. And then you're usually going to end with, in the SAR framework, results. And that's fine if you end your story with results, but I think what's most important is that you end showing a shift in your perspective, right? How did this change you? Whether the result was good or bad, how did this change you as a person or shift your perspective? All right, so use the 3S's in your interviews when you're preparing your stories. In your essays, I've said this a lot, but I'm going to keep repeating it. Have more scenes and less lecturing, and put your scenes at the beginning of the essay and put your lecturing towards the end. And just that tip alone will really make your essays a lot better. And again, this requires a lot of work and jogging of your memory, but it'll be worth it. And then for your resume and CV, I think a lot of MBA applicants, when they're asked a question like, could you walk me through your work history, or walk me through what you've done since college, they often kind of repeat their resume and their responsibilities, which the interviewer will generally already have your resume and have an idea of what you did at your various companies and organizations. So when you're asked a question like that, connect the dots and explain to the interviewer why you moved from one job to the next, or one company to the other, or one function to the other. Connect the dots for your listener. What you're really doing here is explaining the shifts in your perspective, right? And you can do it in a more engaging way with scenes or with stakes as well. So that's my tip there with resumes. And then finally with recommendations. Again, it takes a lot of work to jog your memory and to find the scenes of your stories. So imagine how difficult it would be for your recommender, right? To tell really powerful stories about you. So after you do that work, you can help jog your recommender's memory of projects or scenes that can help him or her write more powerful stories for you. So I think that's what I would do with recommendations. So anyhow, I really hope this episode helps you select and craft your best stories for your MBA application. The best stories are compelling and will make the reader feel closer to you, or the listener feel closer to you, like they know you better. And just to use a quote from the Moth book, you want to share stories that pull at your heart, make your blood boil, make your belly laugh, make your eyes widen, or your brain tick, where you start as strangers and end closer. And this is really hard, even harder than preparing for the GMAT. It requires you to reflect on who you are and what's important to you. But I think it's an important exercise, not just for MBA applications, but for yourself as you evolve in your career. Sorry, I know this sounds a bit lecture-y, I'm inventing a word. But I hope this episode also encourages you to sharpen and share your stories so that your colleagues and customers and friends and family, but most importantly yourself, that you can see yourself with new eyes. And I just want to end this episode with a quote. When you choose to share a story, you share a piece of yourself. Stories explain your heart, decode your history, and decipher who you are. Thanks for listening to the Touch MBA podcast. Remember, you can get free school selection help and a profile review at touchmba.com. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Just search for Touch MBA.